I guess I have to remember to hit record. So we'll try this again. Video 3 on middlemen. So I think I left off after the saddle tramp said, I'm performing you a service, I'm reducing transaction costs, I'm reducing your ignorance, right? Now, of course, in the real world, how does this happen? Turns out it's easier much of the time when we have money values for things rather than, right? So if, for example, Sam had posted a public price for his beans, or which he was willing to buy beans and which he was willing to sell peaches, and Bill had done the same thing, a set of competing bids and offers, it would have been a lot easier for the saddle tramp, and the saddle tramp might have taken a smaller share of that, who knows. But the gains from trade would still be there. And so it turns out that money, again, the point of middlemen and the point of money is information generation. Information is going to help us avoid mistakes. Middlemen are people who specialize in moving resources from low to high valued use. Thus, how ties make it from people in Turkey to people in Billings. Part of the way they make it there is through the middlemen at Men's Warehouse and the suppliers along the supply chain and so on and so forth. So here would be a question. How much information should we have? What's the optimal amount of information? You might think we would want to have, since information helps us reduce mistakes and mistakes are costly, we would probably want to have as much information as possible. But hopefully you're thinking like an economist now, and you're realizing that we would only want another unit of information as long as the benefit of that additional piece of information is greater than the cost. Now, we oftentimes assume that information is costless. And I know my head is right in the way. If information is costless, then as long as there is some benefit of information, we would want more information. But of course, you hopefully realize by now that there is always a cost. There's going to be time. There may not be an expense of more information, but there will always be a cost. And so, how much information would we want? It's a good question. It's a question I discuss with my therapist a lot of times, right? Do you have enough information to make an informed decision? If not, where would you get more information? At what point would you stop acquiring information? And this is hard to figure out in the real world, but we know that this is what we would want to do. Turns out that middlemen are information providers. Hopefully they're reducing the cost of acquiring information here. Now, people complain about middlemen because they assume that information is costless. And if it is, then middlemen provide no value. But if information isn't costless, which we know it isn't, then they can provide a useful service. In effect, successful middlemen are people who have a comparative advantage in information provision. And people complain about them because we believe that information should be or is free. Now, this may seem a little abstract. In many other countries, you have there's a larger group of people who are easily identifiable as middlemen. But in the United States, one example that it may just be where I'm at in life, given that friends and colleagues are oftentimes talking about or thinking about buying a house. And they oftentimes will talk about, this real estate agent. I mean, they're nice, they're kind, they're helpful, but why, they're getting this large fee. They get this large fee, this certain share of the sale price, and it's a lot of money. Now that I found a house to buy, I actually could have been a lot better off if the seller and I had been able to find each other. Now that we have found each other, let me rephrase it. Now that we've found each other, we know that we'd be better off. So why don't we bypass the real estate agent? And here would be the right? Is The question is, would you have found the other person, and would you have found the other person as easily as you did without this agent? If the answer is yes, then you should bypass the real estate agent. If the answer is no, then you probably don't want to. So as an example, the first time, despite the fact that in this day and age, almost none of us use travel agents anymore. The first time I went to Iraq, the first plane trip, it was through a travel agent that the university I was working for recommended, but I got my ticket from a travel agent. I didn't know anything about airplane connections. I didn't know anything about the airports, about getting into Sulaymaniyah, about how to transit through through the Jordan airport, etc. So I actually chose to use a middleman in that instance. Once you have the information, however, you don't need the middleman anymore. Now, in this day and age, in the real estate agent market, we will see what happens. I suspect that real estate agents, like travel agents, some of them will cease to exist as it becomes easier to find people online. But they also, some of the ones that do persist are almost certainly going to have to broaden their information provision and maybe even branch into some other services. If not, simply on the information provision side of things, we may not need as many of them. Some professions will change as information provision becomes more accessible. Similar thing to auction houses. I don't know how many of you have been to an estate sale or an estate sale auction or an auction house. I had a girlfriend in graduate school who was very into estate sales and auctions. I also know that, growing up, we would go to ranch auctions, and when we sold our ranch, we had somebody come out and auction all the stuff off. Those still happen, but most of us don't go to auction houses anymore. Although we do oftentimes participate in auctions. If any of you have ever purchased something off eBay, you in effect have gone to an auction. And that, again, has been facilitated by the internet. So this is saying that things will change. This is one way to look at, again, looking at professions. What is your major comparative advantage? Is your comparative advantage information provision? If so, you're going to have to stay ahead of the internet or be the person on the internet who's making this easy. This is one of the reasons why I think that to some extent my role as an educator has changed from what it would have been 100 years ago. It is much easier now to find the information, the facts, the figures, these things that I talk about. And had my role stayed being one of simply recording what's basically in any textbook, then there wouldn't be a lot of reason for you to pay me to do anything. So my role probably needs to be something that has adapted and changed from one of pure information provision. So again, we could bypass middlemen, and in some cases we do. In other cases we don't. In the cases where we don't, it could be that we're foolish, or it could be that, in effect, the benefit of bypassing them is less than the cost. In other words, the time, energy, and money that we save bypassing them is outweighed by the time and energy that it takes to get the additional information. So, brings us to a general point. Probably shouldn't compare actual situations with the ideal. In other words, Sam and Bill might say, look, now that we know, or if we had known this, we don't need the saddle tramp. So the ideal is a world of perfect information, and the real is one in which information takes time, energy, and resources to parse. So again, this oftentimes happens if you have a broker, a real estate broker, selling your house. You find somebody, you pay a 5% commission to that person, and then after the fact you say, gee, now that you and I know each other, now that we know each other and you've bought my house, really would have, how foolish of us to use this real estate agent. Now, I actually can speak from experience, knowing that there are, remind myself to put my phone on silent. I haven't bought or sold houses, but I have spoken with people who have, and some of them started out by for sale by owner. And 3 months or a year later, They said, you know what? I probably should get a real estate agent. And then the real estate agent oftentimes was able to find them, either counseled them, that could be an additional service, counseled them that their price was too high, gave them some sense of what was going on in the market, again, information, or simply made it easier to find other people. So markets, again, as I hope we've taken away from some of this, markets are information generating devices. They're discovery mechanisms. And part of what plugs into that information generating system is people who have a comparative advantage and who specialize in generating that information. Markets generate or create indices of value that make it easier, usually in terms of dollars, that make it easier for decision makers because they place clear price tags on valuable resources. So we talked about a while ago, prices are hugely important. They contain a huge amount of information, and that information is generated, not revealed in the process of exchange. They communicate opportunity costs. And again, if we think about markets, that's really what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a set of interrelationships, a set of bids and offers. Markets aren't places. Now, in many countries, you can go to the market. In Iraq, you would go to the bazaar. In Togo, you'd go to the marché. Again, whatever the local term was for this. But that really, the market is a larger thing than this, right? It's this system of social coordination, again, with decent underlying rules that allow people to compete, not just with not suppliers with other suppliers, and some consumers with other consumers, right? This is not unique to capitalism. This permeates pretty much all of human relations. Whether you think about traffic or college courses or food lines or rooms in the dining hall or thinking about the marriage market. Now, when I talk about the marriage market in Iraq, many of my students would say, yeah. So, Rania, right? You take a kilo of gold and you go over to Rania. What are you talking about? And in Iraq, there was actually a marketplace where you could go and buy a spouse. It's not necessarily what I'm talking about. But if you think about the marriage market, the market for a significant other or the market for a spouse, if you're into the whole marriage game, is there a market? Is there a supply of significant others and spouses? Is there a demand? I'd say so. However, do we have clear-cut standardized prices? Not in this country. Now, in some places around the world, you do have clear-cut standardized prices. My students could tell me how many kilos of gold I would need to take to the market, to the marriage market, in order to find a spouse. So some markets have clear-cut standardized prices and others do not. So the question would be why? Which ones would have standardized prices, which do not, and why? Does it make sense? Is there an issue there? Something to think about. Here's some things that might factor into that. We might have a question of, is what's on offer a standardized product? That might be relevant. Another piece here might be how often you buy this item. How many repeated interactions you have about this item. So if you think about where will it be easier for values to acquire money prices? Again, these prices are a representation of the cost to the suppliers and a benefit to the consumers. I would argue that it's typically if we think about, there is a benefit of standardized prices, but there is a cost, right? It's going to take some time and energy to figure that out. And you'd want to have standardized prices, clear money prices when the benefit of doing so is greater than the cost. So I would argue that typically it's going to be more commonly feasible and sensible for values to acquire money prices when you have a standardized product. If If it's not standardized, then we'd have to describe all of the different characteristics of it. We can still end up with a money price, but it's going to be a little bit costlier to do so. And so fewer actions that are not standardized are holding all else constant. Again, big assumption, not everything else will be constant. But holding all else constant, we would expect that goods with standardized prices, standardized goods that are standardized products would more frequently acquire money prices. Same thing for repeated interactions. Many goods and services, right? How often are you going to buy a house? Hopefully you're only going to buy a house once, maybe twice in your life. Now, if you are, so probably not going to make sense to necessarily, first of all, houses oftentimes are not standardized products. So we would actually, holding all else constant, expect to have standardized prices or money prices on somewhat clear and transparent posted prices on houses in housing developments where pretty much all of the units are standardized than in single construction homes because that, right, it's easier to specify for a standardized product. But even in that case, we might not get standardized prices because people don't engage in repeated interactions. Now, I suspect, talking with people who deal in the real estate market, who buy and sell rental properties, etc., they have a pretty good idea. I mean, they say, look, it's a 3-bedroom in this location with 2 bath. That's like $100,000 or whatever it is. Like, I'm making that up completely. But they tend to, people who engage in repeated interactions, who buy and sell a lot of these things, same thing with cars, right? How often do you buy a car? Hopefully not that often. But people who specialize in the secondary market and used cars, which are, I've dealt with car brokers before, they get a pretty good idea. They go to car auctions and they have a pretty good idea of a 15-year-old Subaru is going for this much. That's really right. And so this isn't an answer, but it's an interesting thing to think about. Why do some things have a standardized money price and others do not? Why do we use prices in some instances to ration resources and not in others? I think that's an interesting question. Another lens to look at the world. Again, the answer would probably be because the benefit is greater than the cost. But the question is, what story matches with that answer? But one big thing to take away from this, just like with Sam and Bill, one of the big takeaways would be to stifle information because we dislike imperfect information. So to stifle information because we dislike imperfect information, or to stifle information because we don't like what that information is telling us, right? So wage and price controls, which increasingly we are discussing putting wage and price controls on things to try and deal with things in this crisis. Now, there may be reasons to do that. I'm pretty suspicious about that. But say that somebody says, look, the price of ventilators is going through the roof. This is crazy. Now, hopefully some of us understand that price on ventilators is providing incentive for some suppliers to produce more, and it's also providing information and incentives to consumers to consume less, to cut back, so they can leave some things on the shelf for other people. But the key here is to stifle information provision because we dislike the information that's being provided is very similar to somebody punching a rain gauge or a thermometer. So how many of you, when it comes, right, still a little chilly out there. I was this morning before class, went out and sat on my front step, or it was sunny, it looked gorgeous, and there was nobody around, so I figured I could at least stick my head outside. I got out there and I went, this is kind of chilly. So I went back in and looked at my thermometer, and it said it's 45 degrees, so I threw the thermometer across the apartment and beat the crap out of it, right? Of course not. That's ridiculous. Even though I didn't like the information that the thermometer was telling us. Same thing, I never saw my father punch a rain gauge when I was growing up. There were many times growing up as a rancher in southeastern Montana that I'm sure when my father went to look at the rain gauge in the morning, he was very frustrated and upset. But that information, that rain gauge was just giving him information about the rain that had fallen during the night. And I never saw him punch it. Now, occasionally somebody might get irritated and haul off and punch something, but they understand that that's stupid. That's a foolish idea. Putting constraints on prices, and prices being an information communication and generation device. Putting constraints on prices is effectively and analytically identical to punching a rain gauge or punching a thermometer. But it turns out, right? I mean, if you think about that, that's equally absurd. But we do actually put a lot of constraints on this here. Again, as I mentioned, I'm still haven't figured out whether the price of toilet paper has gone up generally, or if the price of toilet paper hasn't gone up because stores are engaged in voluntary restraint, or if the price of toilet paper hasn't gone up because there are wage and price controls. But generally speaking, I suspect most people would be kind of irritated if the price, or I've seen posts online that people are really irritated that when the price of toilet paper is $10 or $15 a roll. That's like saying, I'm really irritated with my thermometer because it's telling me that it's colder than I want it to be out here. That information, that $15 a roll, if we think about that, what is that doing? In a competitive market, well, let's just think about, right? If the price increases, what is that doing? It is encouraging some people who value that toilet paper less to leave it on the shelf for the other people who value it more. And by the same token, say that, right, with supply, the price increasing is sending information to toilet paper manufacturers that they should ramp up production. It's sending a signal to paper towel manufacturers who could convert their plants over to paper towels that they should do so. And this is, again, it may be hotter or colder than we would like it to be, but the prices are the means. It's just information, and it's also it's an incentive to act on that information. And trying to mess with them, unless we have an understanding or a model for why the price is not what it should be, which would be a whole other question. How would you know that the price is something other than what it should be? If you know that, then we could talk about putting some restrictions on it. Of course, then we'd have to ask the question of what happens next if you do that, what are the incentives that provides, and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, how would you know that the price is higher or lower than it should be? That requires you claiming that you know more than millions and billions of people, or more generally and more defensively, it would require you making a claim that in effect we have rules in place which are standing in the way of prices adjusting in a meaningful way to communicate valid and meaningful information to people. If you can't make that argument, such as we have attenuated property rights where the people who are making the decisions don't bear the cost or get the action or get the benefit, and if you're making that argument there, yeah, it may well be that the price doesn't reflect the value. But generally speaking, if we have good rules in place, we should expect price to reflect the value. And getting upset with prices is really getting upset with other people's valuations, which is understandable. There are many things I look at and I say, that's a crazy expensive thing. I do, right? As an example, I do not understand Rolex watch prices. I mean, I understand them. I understand what they're telling us. I can model them. I can think about why supply is the way it is. I can think about why demand is the way it is and why the price is so much higher. But for me, the prospect of spending $25,000 or $10,000 for a watch on my wrist, did I say 10 or 25,000? Yeah, rather than $10 or $25. That, to me, doesn't resonate. But guess what? I get the information that I shouldn't have one of those watches because I look at the price and I say, ooh, that's a lot of money. I would rather have other things, which tells me I have good substitutes. So again, we have assumed up until now, right? Hopefully you're getting a little bit of a picture now. Up until now, we'd sort of said, look, who knows? If the price is below the market clearing price, who knows? what's going to happen next. But we're pretty sure somebody is going to have an incentive to encourage the supplier to raise the price. Either consumers are going to walk in and say, look, if I pay you more, will you bring me more? At which point the producers say, why, yes, I will. And of course, that increase in price causes some consumers to cut back. And maybe now the consumers go in and they still see empty shelves. And so they go to the shopkeeper at Walmart and they say, look, will you bring me more toilet paper? And the person at Walmart, of course, says, no, we're bringing you as much toilet paper as we want to bring you. And so then you have to say, would you bring me more toilet paper if I pay you more? Now, in this current environment, I think the answer is no, which is puzzling to me. And that's either because we can't increase the price or something else. But we very seldom have to actually go to the merchant and ask them to bring us more. Usually what we discover is that we don't tell our shopkeeper when we're going to show up or what we're going to want to buy, and if they don't have it, we get upset. Part of the reason why it's usually there, we've talked about here with middlemen. We can also bring this in and get a little bit more specific in the next series where we start talking about arbitrage and we start talking about speculators, which are really sort of a specific form of middlemen. So for next class, that should do it for next class. I'll go ahead and record some videos on speculators. It'll continue on from this. This is a little bit of a light lecture. You can hopefully look ahead at some videos for Wednesday. Get out ahead of things, although you don't have to. Hopefully you'll take the weekend to think about some of this, and then also to make sure that you're solid on everything we've covered before, but particularly elasticity. So I will go ahead and record another set of videos on speculators and upload all of these, but definitely listen. Hopefully you've listened to this point. For Monday, you are good to go.